Hi guys, Autumn Weber here, and welcome back to 17 Spooky Stories, my series slash counting down to Halloween videos. And today I thought we'd go for a more kid-friendly book. Meet Molly has always been a part of my Halloween traditions, so we're gonna read it. And I have a little cover inspired outfit going on here, which I think maybe it's the bow. It's kind of giving me Studio Ghibli vibes with the bow here. But anyway, let's get on into reading this book, which I'm pretty sure I've probably read at least 2 other times on this channel. Just keeping it real. So let's do this. Meet Molly, 1944, by Valerie Tripp. Chapter 1, Turnips. Molly McIntyre sat at the kitchen table daydreaming about her Halloween costume. It would be a pink dress with a long floating skirt that would twirl when she turned and swished when she walked. There would be shiny silver stars on the skirt to match the stars in her crown. The top of the dress would be white. Maybe it would be made of fluffy angora, only Molly wasn't sure they had angora back in Cinderella's time. That's who Molly wanted to be for Halloween, Cinderella. All she had to do was, 1, talk her mother into buying the material and making the costume, 2, find some glass slippers somewhere, and 3, convince Linda and Susan, her 2 best friends, to be ugly stepsisters. She could probably talk Susan into it. As long as Susan got to wear a long dress, she wouldn't mind being a stepsister. But Linda was another story. They were going to be fairy tale princesses. Linda would want to be Snow White because she had black hair just like Snow White's. Linda would probably want Molly and Susan to be dwarfs. Probably sleepy and grumpy, thought Molly. Well, Molly certainly felt like grumpy tonight. She looked at the clock. She had been sitting at the kitchen table for exactly 2 hours, 46 minutes, and 1, 2, 3 seconds. She had been sitting at the kitchen table, in fact, ever since 6 o'clock, when Mrs. Guilford, the housekeeper, called everyone to supper. Molly had smelled trouble as soon as she walked into the kitchen. It was a heavy, hot smell, kind of like the smell of dirty socks. She sat down and saw the odd orange heap on her plate. She made up her mind right away not to eat it. "What's this orange stuff?" she asked. Mrs. Guilford turned around and gave her what Molly's father used to call the Gladys Guilford glacial glare. "Polite children do not refer to the food as stuff," said Mrs. Guilford. "The vegetable which you are lucky enough to have on your plate is mashed turnip." "I'd like to return it," whispered Molly's 12-year-old brother Ricky. "What was that, young man?" Mrs. Guilford asked Mrs. Guilford sharply. "I like to eat turnips," said Ricky, and he shoveled a forkful into his mouth. Eating turnips, or anything alive or dead, was no hardship for Ricky. If it could be chewed, Ricky would eat it. Quick as a wink, all his turnips were gone. "That rat Ricky," thought Molly. She looked over at her older sister Jill. Jill was putting ladylike bites of turnip into her mouth and washing them down with long, quiet sips of water. Almost all of the horrible orange stuff was gone from her plate. Molly sighed. In the old days, before Jill turned 14 and got stuck up, Molly used to be able to count on her to make a big fuss about things like turnips. But lately, Molly had to do it all herself. Jill was acting superior. This new grown-up Jill was a terrible disappointment to Molly. If that's what happened to you when you got to be 14, Molly would rather be 9 forever. The turnips sat on Molly's plate, getting cold. They were turning into a solid lump that oozed water. With her fork, Molly carefully pushed away her meat and potatoes to a corner of her plate so that not a speck of the turnip would touch them and ruin them. Disgusting, she said softly. There will be no such language used at this table, said Mrs. Guilford. Furthermore, anyone who fails to finish her turnips will have no dessert, nor will she be able to leave the table until the turnips are gone. That's why Molly was still at the kitchen table, facing a plate of cold turnips at 8:46 p.m. None of this would have happened if Dad were home, she thought. Molly touched the heart-shaped locket she wore on a thin chain around her neck. She pulled it forward and opened it up to look at a tiny picture inside. Her father's face smiled back at her. Molly's father was a doctor. When American soldiers started fighting in World War II, Dr. McIntyre joined the army. Now he was somewhere in England, taking care of the wounded and sick soldiers. He had been gone for several months. Molly missed him every single minute of every single day, but especially at dinner time. Before Dad left, before the war, Molly's family never ate supper in the kitchen. They ate dinner in the dining room. Before Dad left, back before the war, the whole family always had dinner together. They laughed and talked the whole time. Now things were different. Dad was gone, and every morning Molly's mother went off to work at the Red Cross headquarters. Very often she got home too late to have dinner with the family, and she spent at least an hour every night writing to Dad. When a letter came from Dad, it was a surprise and a treat. Everyone gathered and listened in silence while Mrs. McIntyre read the letter aloud. Dad always sent a special message to each member of the family. He told jokes and drew funny pictures of himself, but he didn't say which hospital he worked in or name any of the towns he visited. That wasn't allowed because of the war. And even though Dad's letters were long and funny and wonderful, they still sounded as if they came from very far away. They were not at all like the words Dad spoke in his deep down voice that you could feel rumbling inside you and filling up the house. Molly used to be able to hear that voice even when she was up in her room doing her homework. When Dad would call out, "I'm home," the house seemed more lively. Everyone, even Jill, would tumble down the stairs for a big hug. Then Dad would sit up in his old plaid chair, cozy in a warm circle of lamplight, and they'd tell him what had gone on in school that day. Dad's pipe smoke made the room smell of vanilla and burning leaves. Sometimes now that Dad was gone to the war, Molly would climb into the plaid chair and sniff it because the vanilla pipe smell made her feel so safe and happy, just as if Dad were home. Molly remembered the fun they had at the dinner table when Dad was gone. He teased Jill and made her blush. He swapped jokes with Ricky and told riddles to Brad, Molly's younger brother. And he always said, "Gosh and golly, Ollie Molly, what have you done today?" Suddenly everything Molly had done, whether it was winning a running race or losing a multiplication bee, was interesting and important, wonderful or not so bad after all. Dad loved to tease Mrs. Guilford, too. As she carried steaming trays out from the kitchen with lots of importance, Dad would say, "Mrs. Gladys Guilford, an advancement has been made tonight in the art of cooking. Never before in the history of mankind has there been such a perfect pot roast." Mrs. Guilford would beam and bustle and serve up more perfect pot roast and mashed potatoes and gravy. She never ever served anything awful like turnips. But everything was different now because of the war. Dad was gone and Mom was busy, so Mrs. Guilford, who arrived at the dot of 7 o'clock every weekday morning of Molly's life to cook and clean, now ruled the roost more than ever. And Mrs. Guilford was doing her part to help win the war. A victory garden was Mrs. Guilford's latest effort. Last spring, she sent away for a pamphlet called "Food Fights for Freedom." It explained how to start a victory garden in your own backyard. The pamphlet had a picture of vegetables lined up in front of a potato and an onion that were wearing military hats and saluting. Under the picture it said, "Call vegetables into service. From now on there will be no more canned vegetables used in this house," Mrs. Guilford announced. "The soldiers need the tin in those cans more than we do. From now on we will grow, preserve, and eat our own vegetables. It's the least we can do for our fighting boys." All summer long Mrs. Guilford had tended her victory garden. She wore a stiff straw hat, Dr. McIntyre's gardening gloves, and knee-high black rubber boots. Everyone, even little Brad, had helped her. Molly had worked in the victory garden every Tuesday morning from 10 to 11 o'clock. She had crawled on her hands and knees through rows of green seedlings, pulling weeds. The rows were as strict and as straight as soldiers on parade. Each one was labeled with a colorful seed packet on a stake. The seed packets showed fat carrots, plump red tomatoes, and big fat green beans. But by fall, after months of being in the hot sun, the pictures on the seed packets had faded away. The packets hung on the stakes like limp white flags of surrender. Mrs. Guilford's victory garden had not been quite as victorious as she had hoped, but all but the toughest vegetables had been beaten by the dry summer. The carrots were thin and wrinkled. The tomatoes were hard as nuts. The peas were brown. But that did not defeat Mrs. Guilford. Mrs. Guilford would never give up and open a tin can. She had a rather successful crop of radishes, lima beans, and turnips, so that's what they would eat. As Molly stared at the turnips on her plate, she remembered Mrs. Guilford saying, "Wasting food is not only childish and selfish, it is unpatriotic. Think of your poor father off in some strange land. Maybe he didn't have enough to eat tonight, and you turn your nose up at fresh turnips. You will not leave this table until those turnips are gone completely." Now it was almost 9 o'clock. It was starting to get cold in the kitchen. Molly was lonely. She was tired of thinking about how unpatriotic she was. She looked at the turnips, lifted a tiny forkful, and put it in her mouth. Just then, Ricky burst through the swinging kitchen door. How do you like eating old, cold, moldy brains? He teased. Then he ran out. Molly swallowed the turnips fast, then gulped down a whole glass of water. Old, cold, moldy brains was exactly what the turnips were like. She would not eat one speck more. "Ricky, you rat!" she said. "I'm gonna get you!" She started to get up from her chair. From behind the door, Ricky chanted, "Nya, nya, 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 you can't leave the table. You haven't finished your turnips." "Ricky, stop it!" yelled Molly. But Ricky was right. The turnips were still on her plate, and she was stuck. To make matters worse, Molly heard her mother calling goodbye to the carpool she rode with from Red Cross headquarters. "Now Mom will be mad at me too," thought Molly. "Now she'll never make me a Cinderella dress for my Halloween costume. Now everyone in the house will be mad at me for making Mom upset. And all because of these terrible turnips." Mrs. McIntyre walked in the back door, looked at Molly, looked at the plate, and knew immediately what had happened. "Well, Molly," she said, "I see we had our first turnips from the Victory Garden for dinner tonight." "Mom," said Molly, "I hate turnips. I know I do. And Mrs. Guilford says I can't leave the table until I eat them. I'll be here until I die, because I will never eat these. Never. I really mean it." "I see," said Molly's mother. "Do you mind if I join you for a while?" "Not until you die, of course. Just while I have a cup of tea. And while I'm heating up the stove, why don't I reheat those turnips for you? They certainly don't look very good when they're cold like that." "It won't help," said Molly. But Mrs. McIntyre scooped up the turnips and put them in a frying pan. "I'll just smooth out these lumps. And I think we can spare a little bit of our sugar and butter rations to add to the turnips," she said almost to herself. "And a little cinnamon, too." Soon the delicious spicy aroma filled the kitchen. The kettle whistled and Mrs. McIntyre made her tea. She spooned the turnips back onto Molly's plate and put the plate in front of Molly. The hot steam from the turnips warmed Molly's face and clouded her glasses. She took a deep breath, raised a small forkful to her lips, and tasted it. It wasn't so bad. In fact, it was pretty good. Sweet, cinnamony, and kind of like applesauce. It felt good going down. Not at all like old, cold, moldy brains. She ate another forkful. Mrs. McIntyre sat down with her tea. "When I was about your age," she said, "my mother made sardines on toast for dinner one night. Little oily dead fish on toast. I refused to eat them, but my mother said I could not leave the table until the sardines were gone. Gone was exactly what she said. So when she wasn't looking, I put each sardine one by one into my napkin. Then I stuck my napkin into my pocket. When my mother saw my empty plate, she was surprised, but she excused me from the table. I used to play checkers with my father every night after dinner. That night it was very hard to concentrate on the game. Our two cats, Bessie and May, yowled and climbed all over me. They smelled the sardines. Finally, when I had one hand on Bessie and the other hand on a checker, May pulled the napkin out of my pocket. The sardines spilled out all over the rug. Bessie and May gobbled them up. "Oh, Mom," laughed Molly. "Oh, Molly," sighed Mrs. McIntyre. "Sometimes we have to do things whether we like it or not. There aren't always cats around who will eat the sardines." She reached across the table and brushed Molly's bangs out of her eyes. I know this war is hard on you, children, and I know you miss your father. I miss him too. Everything is so different with Dad gone, said Molly. Nothing is the way it used to be anymore. The war has changed things, said Mrs. McIntyre. But some things are still the same. Isn't Ricky still Ricky? He sure is, said Molly. Still dumb old Ricky. And you are still my Ollie Molly, said Mrs. McIntyre. And I am still me. She gave Molly's hand a squeeze. Molly smiled. The turnips were gone. Mom was not mad. Mrs. Guilford wouldn't think that Molly was ruining her war effort. Thanks, Mom, she said as she gave her mother a hug. She walked carefully up the stairs to bed, pretending she was wearing a long, floating pink skirt that swished as she took each step. Chapter 2. Hula Dancers. The next morning dawned all golden and blue and windy. Perfect Halloween weather, Molly thought as she woke up. At breakfast, Mrs. Guilford didn't say anything about turnips, but she made French toast, which was a sign that all was forgiven. It was Thursday, and Molly's friends Linda and Susan were coming home with her after school. They were going to plan their Halloween costumes. They had made a secret pact not to discuss their ideas until they got to Molly's house. Someone might copy us if they heard our ideas, said Molly. Linda and Susan agreed. Besides, it was fun to have a secret pact. It was sort of like being soldiers and keeping battle plans away from enemy spies. As they walked home after school, they met Allison Hargett, who was one of their classmates. She asked, "What are you three going to be for Halloween?" "We can't tell," said Molly. "It's a surprise." "Oh," said Allison. Linda said, "But it's great. It's really a great idea." Susan chimed in. "Yes, it's wonderful. We're going to have the best Halloween costumes ever." Allison looked impressed. Molly was a little worried. The girls hadn't even agreed on what they were going to be. The mystery was making their costumes get a lot of attention. They were really going to have to make good costumes, or else everyone would tease them. "What are you going to be, Allison?" Molly asked. "Oh, probably an angel," said Allison. "My mother said I could wear her white satin dressing gown, and she's already made me some gold wings and a halo." Molly, Linda, and Susan were suddenly very quiet. Molly was jealous. She was sorry she had even asked Allison. An angel. What a great idea. Allison was sure to look wonderful with a halo over her golden hair. It was very hard to have Allison for a friend. Allison was an only child, and her parents were rich and gave her everything that anyone could want. Allison didn't mean to brag about the things that she had, but just by telling the truth, she managed to make everyone resent her. "My mother doesn't even have a dressing gown, much less a white satin one," said Linda glumly. "All she has is a brown terry cloth bathrobe. I know she'd never even let me wear that." "Well," said Molly to Allison, "all I can tell you is that our idea is much more, original than an angel." "Yeah, I know an angel is kind of boring," said Allison quickly. "It was my mother's idea. She made the wings and all." "Well, we'll see you later, Allison," said Molly as she and Linda and Susan hurried away. It made them uncomfortable when Allison started being so nice. When the girls got to Molly's house, they went into the kitchen for a snack. "Hello, Mrs. Guilford," they said together. "Hello, girls," answered Mrs. Guilford. She was watering the parsley plants she'd started to grow on the kitchen windowsill. "There are some apples in a bowl on the table. Help yourselves, but take your apples outside, please. It's too nice a day to be cooped up in the house." "Thank you, Mrs. Guilford," the girls said as they went to sit on the back steps in the sunshine. Ricky was out back too, shooting baskets at the hoop on the side of the garage. He was trying to set the world record for making the most baskets without missing. As the girls munched their apples, Susan said, "Gee, I think an angel is a good idea. Why don't we be angels too?" "Absolutely not," said Molly. "Do you want Allison to think we stole her idea?" "Allison wouldn't mind," said Susan. "I know," said Molly, "but I would mind. We can think of something just as good." "Like what?" "Like what?" asked Linda. "Well," replied Molly slowly, as if she had just thought of it for the very first time, "how about Cinderella and the two stepsisters?" "Ooh," said Susan. "Cinderella." "Who gets to be Cinderella?" Linda asked immediately. "We don't have to decide that right away," said Molly. Let's wait and see who has the best ball dress. And that's the one who will be Cinderella. The other two will be stepsisters." "I don't think it's fair," Linda stated. "Who wants to be an ugly stepsister?" "You're all ugly stepsitters today," teased Ricky. "Get it?" "Cut it out, Ricky," said Molly. Ricky went back to shooting baskets. "I think it's a good idea," said Susan. "My sister Gloria just gave me an old prom dress of hers. It's sort of green with a big petticoat and shining gold threads at the bottom of the skirt. I'll wear that." "Sort of green," Ricky mocked. "Lime bean green is what you mean." "Ricky, go away," said Molly. But she was thinking that Susan's dress sounded perfect for Cinderella, and it had two very big advantages over Molly's floating pink dress with the white Angora top. Susan's dress really existed, and Susan already had it. Being an ugly stepsister was not at all what Molly had in mind. "Wait a minute," she said. "Maybe Linda is right. Maybe it's not fair. Maybe we should all be exactly the same thing, like the Three Musketeers." "You'd be perfect as the Three Little Pigs," said Ricky. "Or you could be the Three Bears. How about the Three Stooges? Or the Three Kings of Orient?" He began to sing in a loud, teasing voice. "We three kings of Orient are, try to smoke a rubber cigar. It was loaded, it exploded." "Stop it! Stop it!" yelled Molly. And suddenly, Ricky did stop. His face turned red. He bounced the basketball under his legs, then behind his back. He leaned casually against the garage and twirled the ball on the tip of one finger. The girls turned around to see who he was showing off for. It wasn't Mrs. Guilford or even Mrs. McIntyre. Nobody was there except Jill and her new best friend, Dolores. They were walking up the driveway carrying their school books. Dolores was wearing a